So welcome everybody to another CTO webinar. And before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet today. And I pay my respects to all Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal elders, Torres Strait Islander peoples that are here with us today. So welcome everybody. This presentation will describe trauma and explore its impacts and will introduce you to the principles of trauma-informed care. You will have the opportunity to consider how trauma-informed care can be utilised in your workplace. And you'll note today that your cameras have been turned on, and you sneaky people that have turned them off. If you'd like to just leave your cameras on today, we can leave your audio off for the time being. We'll have a bit more of an engagement presentation today. So with that said, I'd like to introduce to you today our presenter from Phoenix, Australia. I'd like to welcome Dr. Anna Wolf. Hi, Anna.
Hi, thank you.
Anna is the clinical psychologist and research fellow at Phoenix, Australia, currently working in the training and workforce development team. She has worked as a clinician for over 10 years across various public and private hospitals and not-for-profit organisations. With both her clinical and research background, she provides specialist trauma-focused education and training to various organisations, health professionals and the public. So without further ado, I'd like to get you to take it away, Anna, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Vicky.
Beautiful.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, good to see you all. And thanks for popping your cameras on if you feel comfortable. So today, as Vicky said, we're going to have a bit of an introduction into trauma-informed care. Throughout the session, I really do want to try to make this as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions if you've got questions. I often find it handy if you pop up your little hand, your raise hand emoji, because that will pop you up to the top of the screen. And you can also note down some questions in the chat function as well. So thanks, Vicky, for doing the acknowledgement of country, and you've also gone through my little bio. So hi, welcome. Before we get started, I do want to just quickly highlight who Phoenix Australia is. So we are an independent, non-for-profit organisation, and we've got an affiliation with Melbourne Uni. And for a number of years now, I think it's over 25 years, we've helped promote the recovery of people who've experienced trauma. And that's our continued mission. So that's really what we're about today. I do want to highlight, before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of today, trauma will be discussed, as you probably guessed. And obviously this can be quite distressing for some people. So really, please do look after yourselves during today's session. Take time out, step away from the computer, get some fresh air, grab a cup of tea if you need to. And if you're noticing your distress is continuing, please do seek support. So whether that's through your EAP or your regular GP or psychologist. And we've also got some of these phone and web-based mental health support contacts here as well. I should have also noted that you will be provided with these slides after today's session, so you'll have access to them then. So today, Vicky did, mention broadly what we're talking about. So today we are going to be learning a bit about trauma-informed care, and really we're taking a perspective of just enhancing our knowledge about it. We're going to define trauma. We're going to touch on the ways in which traumatic events can impact on people. We're going to describe recovery pathways after people have experienced trauma. And we're also going to, as I mentioned before, some of you might have heard, just give you a really brief introduction into our TIC online course that you might be interested in. And as I mentioned throughout, please do ask questions. I want to make this as interactive as possible. So jumping in, what is trauma-informed care? Well, a group of researchers have really quite nicely, I think, highlighted some of the key aspects of trauma-informed care. So we've got this description up here. So trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework, and it's grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma. It emphasises the physical, the psychological, and the emotional safety for both providers and trauma survivors. And it also creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So we will go into a bit more detail about what all of that means. But again, thinking more broadly about TIC, TIC is really relevant to both organisations from an organisational perspective and also to workers themselves about how you might interact with service users. TIC is used in a whole different range of different services, whether it's trauma specialist services or other organisations, particularly where it might be likely that someone has experienced a trauma. Over time, so trauma-informed care was initially sort of thought about in around 2001, but over time it's sort of evolved and it's morphed, but it's been further informed by more research, by practice knowledge, and also, I guess importantly, by trauma survivors themselves. They've had input into how this looks. It also acknowledges the fact that individual workers might experience trauma. So that's either within their workplace or within personal life. So it supports employee wellbeing. So that's a very, very broad brush description, I guess, of TIC. But if we're to sort of hone down a little bit more, what are the aims of TIC? Well, TIC really has 4 aims. The first is to minimise trauma-related barriers to accessing and then also to engage with services. So, for example, organisations might provide information that helps survivors feel in control of their engagement with the service, or it might be a bit about like what you're doing today, upskilling staff around what trauma is and trauma-informed care is. It's about minimising potential harms from service delivery. So an example of this is that, trauma survivors might notice cues in their environment, stimuli in their environment that might be triggering. So to minimise the potential harms, might be thinking about what these triggers might be. Providing services that support hope and self-determination. Again, we're thinking about the fact that people have a better chance at engaging with support and have a better chance of coping with or recovering from trauma if they're given that chance to have that help, that hope and that self-determination. And finally, trauma-informed care is also, as I mentioned before, about making sure that the providers are also safe in their workplace and their well-being is considered. And that way, it's not only supporting their well-being, but also the needs of the trauma survivors. So trauma-informed care is really, as I said, it's changed across time. And the way that Phoenix Australia conceptualises TIC, we've got these 7 key principles here. So being trauma aware, being culturally responsive, building safety and trust, giving choice and control, focusing on strengths, facilitating connections, and believe in recovery. So you might be thinking, oh yeah, I think I can understand what some of those things might mean for my work, but you might not. So let me go into a little bit more detail about some of them. But before I do, I guess another kind of key point in relation to TIC is that it doesn't necessarily prescribe a set of procedures. It's really about organisations collaborating with staff and service users about how these principles might be best applied within the organisation. So the process of becoming trauma-informed is really an ongoing and evolving process. So I actually quite like this little diagram here, and it's actually a bit blurry on my screen, so hopefully it's not as blurry on yours, but this is actually a little diagram showing the different principles. And at the centre here, we have being trauma aware and being culturally responsive. And these are really at the heart of how you might implement trauma-informed care. And they guide the implementation of these principles. So what do I mean by that? So being trauma aware, it's really thinking about and understanding what trauma is and what it looks like and its impacts. And today we will go into quite a bit of detail about that. When we're being culturally responsive, we're ultimately thinking about the fact that our culture can impact on the way that we experience trauma. It can impact on the way that we respond to trauma. And when I guess when I talk about culture, I'm not just talking about, race or ethnicity. So it might even be things that, that people consider their own identity around. So gender and sexual orientation, perhaps their activity limitations, where they live, etc. So all of these things can shape the way that the type of trauma that people can experience and also the way that they might respond. So thinking about that, then we can go on to thinking about these other principles. Building safety and trust. We can think about this one in the context of the fact that most traumatic experiences involve some sort of threat. So whether it's physical or whether it's psychological. And so workers and organisations really must work to establish physical safety and psychological safety to those who have experienced trauma. Again, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, that staff safety would sort of fall within that principle as well. And again, the better that the staff feel, the better able they are to form, trusting, respectful relationships with the trauma survivors. Giving choice and control, this next principle up here. Again, we can think about this one in terms of the fact that people who have experienced trauma have often had no control over what's happened, or perhaps they might have been forced to make terrible choices. So these experiences can then impact on the way that service users engage with the service. So if you were to apply TIC, you might support that person to better articulate their needs or accommodate their choices. Focusing on strengths, again, thinking back to that first slide that we saw about TIC, it's a strengths-based framework. What does that mean? Basically, individuals, while they may have experienced trauma and they may be experiencing difficulties as a result, they have ultimately survived and they've ultimately found ways to cope. So TIC really requires us to view service users as actually quite resourceful and resilient. And finally, the second last one is facilitating connections. So we as humans, we all exist on this, in the context of relationships. But often traumatic experiences can involve violations to these relationships through inflicting pain or abuse of power. So inevitably, people who have experienced trauma might actually find it hard to trust others. And in turn, they might become more socially withdrawn and isolated. They might find it difficult to engage with other sorts of relationships or services. So TIC really involves thinking about the relationship that service users have with workers. So drivers, for example, when you have that little chat when they're getting in the car and along the way, but also connections to the broader community as well. So I guess with the central work that you do, you're really helping facilitate those connections already. And finally, we really need to consider enhancing people's belief in recovery. So while people respond to or live with or recover from trauma in really different ways, this principle really highlights the fact that in order to improve their coping and quality of life, we need to emphasize that they can do this and support them in this journey. We will talk a little bit more at the end of today's session as well about recovery and recovery trajectories. So I'm very much aware that I've just sort of bombarded you with quite a lot of information there. Does anyone have any questions about any of these principles or any of the aims of TIC or that initial definition?
No questions have popped in as of yet, unless somebody would like to raise their hand. No?
That's okay. It's a lot to digest.
Thank
I
you.
guess-
No.
No, okay, thanks. Thank you. I guess as we're going through today, another kind of key thing is to start to think about how you might be able to apply some of these things within your work or where this might kind of come up. But again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So as I said, this be trauma aware principle is really central. And so today we're going to be talking quite a lot about being trauma aware, and we'll become more trauma aware, hopefully, once we've finished this session. So that trauma awareness is really about individual workers and also the organisation incorporating this into all aspects of work. And what do I mean by trauma? So in order to better understand how we can be trauma aware, of course, we need to understand what trauma is. So trauma is actually quite inconsistently used within the mental health field. At times it's used to describe an event, and other times it's describing the psychological injury arising from an event. Literally, the word trauma means wound. And you might have heard it quite routinely used in the sort of physical health sector to describe, an injury. But at the end of the day, in mental health terms, it refers to an injury or damage to a person's emotional or psychological health and well-being. Now, a whole wide range of different events can be experienced as traumatic, and they all have the potential to lead to negative emotional and physical after effects. So just now, have a bit of a think, and I'm going to pose this question to you, and if you feel comfortable answering it, please do. What are the features of an event that contribute to it being traumatic? So what does a traumatic event look like?
Anybody?
Just have a think to yourself, even if you don't feel comfortable speaking
Tara
out.
would like to pop on in.
Oh, thank you, Tara.
Someone has to go first, but now I've cut someone more probably interesting off. But anyway, I just had a quick question. Do you mean for the people that we are working with or for the employee? Because I think you can, it could be, so if you're an employee who has perhaps, like in our transport landscape, if you've turned up to an elderly person's home and potentially they have been deceased through to nothing that you've done, but it's just an experience that you've had, that sort of trauma is going to inform those next, how you turn up to other people's homes and what you how you sort of experience that. But then also with our clients or people that use the service, you're often like an elderly person has lived a long time, and trauma is sometimes defined by the experience that they have. It might be subjective to our experience of trauma, but they bring a long life of relationships and experiences. They may have come from overseas, they may be a refugee or a migrant, and so I guess I just wanted to sort of say, trauma can be very subjective, and it can be seen from both perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. I might add to some of what you've spoken about there and sort of think about some of the key things that you've mentioned. So, going to someone's house and, or learning about a death. Death can be a traumatic experience, particularly if you've directly witnessed it. I think another key point is that we often refer to potentially traumatic events. So a whole lot of factors can contribute to someone then having a traumatic experience as a consequence of these traumas. So the event itself can be traumatic to some people, and for others it might be distressing, but not necessarily defined as traumatic. I might elaborate a little bit more, but thanks, Tara. That's really useful to kind of get our juices flowing in terms of what trauma is. As I mentioned, trauma, the definitions are often quite blurry, but one of the ways in which we can think about the features that contribute to events being traumatic: exposure to death or threat of death. So that's sort of what you mentioned. Actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. And these things might be experienced directly, or they might be witnessed. So, you might be in the room or in the general vicinity of some of these things happening. Or you might also learn about these things from a close family or a friend who's been exposed, or maybe a client. The events are often sudden and unexpected. They could be prolonged, they could be intense. They might be a single event, so, a car accident, for example, or they might be repeated over time. They might also, I mentioned this earlier, they might also involve repeated exposure to written or visual details about something traumatic. So that's that sort of vicarious. So we're not actually directly experiencing it, and we're not kind of close to it, personally speaking, but it can still have an impact. And often the features, the emotional features involve feelings of fear, feelings of helplessness, powerlessness, and quite often massive emotional reaction of feeling completely overwhelmed. Again, when we're thinking about being trauma aware in our work, we've also got to think about the fact that trauma is actually quite common. So there are estimates that up to 75% of Australian adults have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lives, and most have reported 2 or more. And more than 2/3 of those people will have experienced it in their childhood or adolescence, so by the age of 16. So again, when we're thinking about trauma-informed care being applied in workplaces where service users or workers might have experienced trauma, you could pretty much consider it to be any workplace. When we're thinking about the specific kinds of potentially traumatic events that are common in Australia, that can sort of again start to help us think about what might be common for our clients. So they might be about having someone close to you die unexpectedly, seeing someone badly injured or killed, or unexpectedly seeing a body, family violence, sexual assault or threatened sexual assault, being in a life-threatening car accident, being sexually abused as a child, being involved in a major natural disaster or a man-made disaster. And I guess, that's sort of becoming more commonplace in Australia as well. So these are some of the common traumatic events that can occur within Australians. So again, thinking about your own workplace, I want you just to first think about what kinds of traumatic incidents have the people who access your service experienced. And when I ask that, I'm going to put a massive caveat to say that you might not know. You probably don't know. And that's okay. We don't need to know for sure that someone has had a traumatic experience in order to implement TIC. So start to think about, what might you see? How might that person present? What does that look like? And then also in turn, how does that impact on that person's capacity to engage with your service? Does anyone have a think or share what you're thinking?
Perhaps this is a good one for one of our providers to pop on in.
They could be nervous about a
Oh.
situation, or, showing anxiety in traffic or near trucks or going through a tunnel, or they can be short-tempered or cross, or telling the driver where to go and how to go. No, don't go that way, don't go this way. And yeah, they can be their behavior is almost belligerent or controlling, or rude, or aggressive or assertive. And you think, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah. You've named some really common behaviors and emotions that can result from trauma. So yeah, spot on. That they would definitely could suggest that person has experienced trauma. Thank you for that. And sorry, I didn't see who that was. So thank you to whoever that was.
That was Helen.
Helen, thank you, Helen.
And I have my camera off because I'm at home and the light's all bad and it's awful.
No worries, no worries. Thank you for your contribution. So yes, absolutely. We see changes in, I guess you've noted those emotional changes, maybe being aggressive or anxious, changes in behavior. So they might be sort of quite demanding in where to go, which way to go. There might actually be changes in their mental or cognitive capacity as well. So, when we think about that, I guess we can think about the fact that they might have trouble decision making or remembering things or planning, which way to go or what they need to do in their day. Trauma can also impact on the way that people's perceptions of the world. So the world can often be seen as a really dangerous place because it was for them. They can also have physiological or body changes. So this might be, feeling keyed up or on edge, or maybe feeling more jumpy. I don't know if anyone's had a passenger that's maybe been a bit more jumpy if you've driven past somewhere or come to a stop. So really, when we're thinking about these common reactions to trauma, we can broadly think about them in terms of these 4 domains, and that's what we might see. So I've got these reactions just listed here, and I won't go through them today, but as I said, you've got that for reference when I send out the slides at the end of the day. So you've got the sort of shorter term impacts, but longer term consequences of trauma can involve difficulties in making and maintaining relationships. There might be difficulties around certain roles, so whether it's parenting, caring, working, and then that in turn has knock-on effects and can increase adversity. So, there might be loss of income, there might be insecure housing, there might be mental health disorders, whether they're sort of diagnosable or not. But at the end of the day, again, when we're thinking about trauma and trauma reactions, each person's response is really unique and it depends. And Tara, this might kind of link back to some of what you were saying earlier. It can depend on their background, if they're an immigrant or if they're from a group that perhaps is more likely to have experienced other traumas or experienced more discrimination or disadvantage. So these are sort of some of the, the environmental issues, other stresses in their life. So, I guess some of these things here can kind of have a negative knock-on effect. You know, having financial stresses and housing problems can then further increase that person's mental distress. And also, and this is a really big key one, and this is also where you guys step in, is the fact that the level of the support that they can access is really a huge factor in terms of how people recover from trauma or cope with trauma. So the research basically shows that people who have a lot of supports around them are much more likely to cope better and recover better. So again, you know, you're providing that service to help people do that, which is great. At the end of the day, you know, we did sort of talk about some of the things that can happen, some of the ways that trauma can present, and actually they can be quite difficult and they can be quite confronting or challenging to deal with. One thing, and I guess, you know, if you're to take kind of one thing out of today's session, I think it might be this: thinking about that those difficult behaviours, as difficult as they are for you to cope with, we can think about them as being symptoms or behaviours that might be understandable reactions to trauma. And often those reactions might have actually been quite useful in the traumatic experience that they've had. So, for example, feeling keyed up and on edge, that would actually help that person to, you know, flee a danger. Have you heard of the fight or flight response? Yeah. So thinking about that. So, you know, we've been designed back in caveman days when saber-toothed tiger came up to us. Our bodies and brains would naturally kick into this fight or flight. So we could survive. We could either fight it or we could run away from it. And a lot of the ways that trauma presents is a product of that. So thinking about these behaviours and ways of feeling and expression might actually be their best attempts to cope. And if you were to, rather than say what's wrong with this person, ask what's happened to that person. So as I said, I think this might be a really nice key shift that you can have when you're working with trauma survivors. What's happened to this person, not what's wrong with this person. Okay, so when we think about the impacts of trauma, we can also think about the recovery from trauma. And while everyone's recovery and the way that trauma presents looks different, research has basically shown that people can follow 4 fairly consistent trajectories in terms of recovery. So this is a nice graph that demonstrates that. So up here on this axis, we've got functioning. And so by functioning, we're talking about, you know, how they're going day to day, whether they're at work, whether they have got useful relationships, whether they've got mental health issues that they're struggling with, and low down the bottom and high up the top. And then along this axis, we've got, say, a potentially traumatic event happening here, and then over months and years, how things progress. So let me talk to you about these 4 different recovery trajectories. So we've got, firstly, the resilient trajectory. So this one, as you can see, people maintain a fairly high level of functioning, pretty much consistent with where they were at to start with. So there might be very little obvious distress or decline. We've also got the recovery trajectory. So that's that purple one. So here people might display quite significant mental health problems and then a disruption in their functioning. And this generally lasts, you know, several months, but then they do return to healthy functioning afterwards. The persistent trajectory is that black one there. And as you can see, people might, after the event, they might actually have mental health issues that might last quite a while. For those people, you might also see, drug or alcohol related problems as well, persistent relationship difficulties or occupational difficulties. And finally, we've got people who follow the delayed recovery trajectory, which is that blue line there. So this one is they follow a course of being relatively high functioning still after the event, but then over a period of time since the trauma, their functioning declines. So these are different recovery trajectories, and again, you don't necessarily need to know about this specifically, but just know that the majority of people who experience trauma do recover. And again, it's through support such as what you guys are doing, and connecting people with the community that can help them in their recovery. I also do want to highlight, and again, this is a very TIC perspective, we want to highlight the strengths. And one of the strengths in terms of recovery is this potential for post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is really a concept where, whilst trauma can result in these significant negative consequences, it can be associated with a level of positive transformation. So, again, I'm not saying that people would want the trauma to happen. They obviously would prefer it not to have occurred. But some individuals report that that trauma can result in an enhanced sense of self, enhanced personal strengths, increased sense of connection with others, greater appreciation of life, perhaps increased compassion or altruism, perhaps enhanced spiritual development. So all of these post-traumatic growth areas can actually happen alongside these trajectories. So even if someone has quite persistent mental health issues, for example, after a traumatic experience, they might still have post-traumatic growth as well. And you might see that. So today, just as a bit of a summary, of course, we've talked about trauma-informed care. It's that strength-based framework with the 7 guiding principles. We've sort of delved a bit deeper into that being trauma-aware principle in particular. So understanding trauma and its impacts can really be central to successful delivery of TIC. And again, TIC, we're thinking about it in terms of at all levels, from an organisational level, through policies and procedures, right through to interaction with service users. So just before we finish up, I do want to highlight, as I said, Phoenix Australia has developed this online TIC course. It's a 6-hour course, and don't let that scare you. It's a self-paced course, so you can kind of jump in and jump out as you please. And it's actually quite nicely structured, so there are sort of little chunks of information and work that you can do. So it's really quite digestible. There's also some active learning activities and scenarios. So this will really help you further understand how you can apply TIC in a real world scenario. So we've got the link to the training there. But for those of you who are also interested, Phoenix Australia has also developed a whole lot of free resources, which you can access here. The link's here. And these were actually developed as a part of our disaster mental health hub. But it's got a whole lot of information sheets about what trauma is, its impacts, things like what PTSD is, how families can help, etc. So lots of useful resources there. So just finally, before we finish up, does anyone have any questions, or can I go into a bit more detail about any of this for you? Are you feeling a bit overwhelmed?
They are sometimes a bit of a quiet bunch, so
That's okay.
there was, like you said, quite a lot of information in there to digest and go through, but knowing it is the benefit to being able to
Yeah.
actually apply it and have it in the back of your mind when we're out there supporting our communities.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it does take time to sort of digest it and then in turn think about how you can apply it. And I do want to reiterate that today is really just a brief introduction. So if you're feeling like, what are my next steps? Well, please do think about the course. Please do have a look at some of the other resources and talk to your team members.
Yeah, I got two things front of mind. It said it's not a list of procedures that you have to follow, because each and every person and each and every situation is different, which is totally understandable. And then I think your second or third last slide said, incorporate trauma care into your policies and your procedures. So that would be, the questions to ask, or the considerations to be given within a procedure that is reflective of TIC. That would be helpful. And I wonder if that's in the resources, because I love that question. Oh, what's wrong with her? Versus, I wonder why she's like that. Wonder what's happened to her. And that's maybe a one-liner in almost every policy. Behaviours are unique and maybe because of trauma. So be kind and all of those sorts of things. So how to bring that into the procedure is what's key to me. That's the care that we need to give.
Absolutely, Helen. And again, great question. And within the constraints of today, we couldn't get into that detail. But the way that you can think about incorporating into policies and procedures, I actually think maybe if I just scroll back even to the aim, where are we? Because it's a great question. This is all well and good, but how do we do it? Where are my aims? Here. Can you see that? So, from a policy perspective, you might think about what some of the barriers might be to people accessing your service. So whether that's about thinking about who knows about your service, and then in terms of engaging with the service, you actually even kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of, developing that relationship, being kind to that person. So it might be also about training staff to know how to do that. It might be training staff in order to minimize potential harms if someone discloses a trauma. So part of trauma-informed care can be, how do I talk to this person about this trauma? I don't want to necessarily dismiss it, but perhaps maybe for where I'm at, I don't want to have to hear all the details, or wherever it is, how to manage that disclosure. Training around that can be really useful. So from a policy perspective, having policies around training staff to do it. From a worker perspective, doing that training. In terms of support to workers themselves, again, there can be policies around ensuring that workers aren't exposed to things that might be triggering for them. Having support systems, or at least ensuring that workers know where to access supports. So hopefully, again, I'm talking quite vaguely, but, Phoenix Australia, for example, can work with organisations to come up with those specific policies and those specific practices that might be most relevant for your organisation. Yeah.
And even promotional material, so I want to have a new brochure to say, come and use my service. I can't just say, you know, the buses are clean and the drivers are nice and we'll get you there on time, because that's not addressing anybody with a trauma-related barrier. You know, the words that I use to describe what I'm offering has to be, you know, particularly if I'm promoting transport to medical appointments, they might be like me and hate dentists to such a way that they're never going to go, but or a doctor, or fear of what they're going to hear. The whole language of promotional material and service delivery material should be trauma informed language.
Absolutely. Pretty much what, like, it's everywhere you look, really, at the end of the day, isn't it? It's promotional material, it's in policies, it's in practice, it's how we engage with service users, it's how we engage as a team, it's how managers engage with workers as well, or leaders engage with workers. So no matter where you look, you can take steps around language, around thinking about the impact on people who might have experienced trauma. And at the end of the day, such a large proportion of us have experienced trauma. So having it as commonplace is going to cover you well.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the time. It's 11:02. Did anyone have any other questions? Or again, Helen, great question. Anything else I can further clarify in a minute or so?
No, nothing coming.
No.
All right. Well, I think we might wrap it up then, Anna.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I might just quickly put up, we've got this survey link here. So for those of you who've got, you know, a smartphone, if you could you click on it, and we're just looking to get some feedback about today's session, how helpful it was to you, how helpful I was as a facilitator for you. At the end of the day, we want to just ensure that these sessions are useful to the people who use them. So if you've got time, it would be greatly appreciated if you could click on this link. And I think Connie's also, yes, Connie's put in a link as well that you can click on in the chat. So if it's easier for you to do that, please do so. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. I know you guys do really great work, and I know you're all very super busy. So appreciate your time and coming here, and good luck with your next steps.